Okay, section 9.6 is about another tool for solving quadratic equations. So far we have using your graphing calculator to solve by finding the zeros on your graphing calculator. We have factoring to solve, which works if your equation is factorable. And we have completing the square to solve. The quadratic formula is, like completing a square, a good method to use in all situations. You can always use quadratic formula. The other thing quadratic formula can tell us is how many solutions our equation has without doing all of the work of finding the answers. So before we start with quadratic formula, here is a set of quadratic equations I'd like you to graph. So pause the video, go ahead and graph them, and start to notice and wonder things about those graphs. What would you like to know? What are you curious about as you look at these graphs? Pause the video and come back after you've done this exercise. Okay, so I graphed the first equation, and when I graphed it, it was a parabola. It opened upwards, and the vertex was above the x-axis, which means that this particular parabola will never be equal to 0. It's never going to cross the x-axis. This quadratic equation has no solutions because its related function doesn't cross the x-axis. I graphed the second one, and I noticed that the vertex of that parabola was right on the x-axis, so this one had one solution. The third one, the vertex is considerably below the x-axis. It's even off my graph, but I'm really more interested in the x-axis, so I'm not going to worry about changing my window. This one has two different solutions because it crosses the x-axis in two places. So here's what I wonder. Is there a way to tell, just by looking at the equation without going to the trouble of graphing, how many solutions we can have? And that's what the quadratic formula can do for us. So this is the quadratic formula. I would make sure that you have that written in your notes. For the quadratic formula, we use a, b, and c. A is the coefficient, not the x squared part, but just the number in front of x squared. Remember, if you can't see anything, it's a 1 or maybe a -1. B will be the coefficient in front of the x term, and pay attention to signs. If b is negative, you want to use that. If there's a subtraction sign here, then you want to treat b like a negative number. And c is the constant that's added on. Also, again, pay attention to signs for c. Before you can use the quadratic formula, you have to make sure that your equation is equal to 0. The way you do that is by moving all of your terms over to one side of the equal sign. Again, make sure the quadratic formula is written in your notes so you can refer to it when you're doing homework. There's a quadratic formula song here, but my computer won't record the audio from the internet, so it won't work if I play it here. I will put a link to it on my Schoology page if you want to hear it. So the discriminant, that part that's under the square root sign, the b squared minus 4ac part, is really important because we can tell just by looking at that part how many solutions we have, whether we have a solution, and if so, how many. If b squared minus 4ac is positive, then we will have two different solutions. Remember, that's the situation where our graph has a vertex below the x-axis and opens upward, or above the x-axis and opens downward. The other possibility is that b squared minus 4ac is negative, which will mean that we have no solutions. That either means that the vertex is above the x-axis and it opens up, or the vertex is below the x-axis and it opens down. And then the final possibility is that that discriminant is 0. It's a pretty special case. If the discriminant is 0, then your quadratic equation will have just one solution, and it will be the vertex. The vertex is the one place that touches the x-axis. We're going to do an example of this type of problem. We're going to find the number of solutions for this quadratic. Remember, if I can't see a number in front of x squared, that means a is 1, because this means I have 1 x squared. B in this quadratic is going to be -4, and c in this quadratic will be 3. So if I do b squared minus 4ac, which is the discriminant, I'm going to do negative 4 squared. If you're doing it on a calculator, you need those parentheses. If you're doing it in your head, you're thinking negative 4 times negative 4. And then minus 4 times A times C. So when I do that math, I get positive 16, because a negative times a negative would be positive, minus 12, which is 4. I don't really care what the number is at this point. I just care whether it's positive or negative. It's positive, so I have 2 solutions. If I graphed this equation, I would have, this is an actual graph of this equation. If I graph it, notice how it crosses the x-axis in 2 different places. Go ahead and pause the video and try these problems. Remember, before you can use the quadratic formula, you have to move everything over to one side of the equal sign so that your quadratic is equal to 0. Please stop the video and try these problems before you watch the solutions. Here are my solutions along with graphs for each of these. Remember, you have to move the 4 over before you can use any part of the quadratic formula so that your equation is equal to 0. And then be very careful of signs here. You have 16 minus 4 times negative 4, which would be positive 16, times negative 1, which would be negative 16. If you don't want to think of this as a negative sign, you don't have to. You can think of this as 16 minus positive 16, because you're subtracting and you have 2 negatives within the subtraction. The answer is 0, which means that you have 1 solution. And then for the other equation, I don't need to move anything. It's already equal to 0. So I'm doing 16 minus 4 times 5. 16 minus 20 would be negative 4. So this one has no solutions. So here's one more for you to try. I want to point out that your life can be easier for this problem if you divide everything by negative 1, but I'm going to go through it with the numbers as they are. So A is equal to negative 8, B is equal to negative 10, and C is equal to negative 6. So I'm going to do B squared. Oops. Minus 4 times A times C. So I have 100, because a negative times a negative would be a positive, minus negative 32 times 6. Oh, 32 times 6 is 192. Oh, so 100 minus 192 would be negative 92, so there are no solutions for this quadratic. The next video will be about actually using the quadratic formula to find those solutions, but the first part of 9.6 and the 9.6a homework is just about the discriminant and how many solutions you have.